Good evening and welcome to the PSS Insights podcast. My name is Andre Lobo. I'm the Executive Director of PSS, Personal Search Services, Re and Bernson. Today I have as a guest Mr. Gautam Hirdaramani. Gautam is a strategy consultant with ECube. So Gautam, maybe we'll get into the term itself, right? So if we just go by a very simple definition, E stands for the environment, social is S, and G is governance. Can you elaborate on that? So while we know what the terms mean in terms of the definition,
Sure.
what is it? How does ESG work in the context of business?
So ESG as a terms, one is has actually gained popularity over the last few years. It's actually a framework. So like you normally have balance sheets and annual reports that actually tell you about a company's financial success and a lot of other performance metrics. ESG is a framework to assess the non-financial aspects of a company. I think today there's a huge growing need that investors and society generally want companies to be less extractive, be more sustainable, and be better for the planet. I mean, we're all experiencing climate change across the world, and we understand that if we don't do something to forget just arrest it, we have to actually backtrack and like reduce where we are at and improve that. So it's basically a framework. There's a lot of investment managers globally that have committed to using ESG metrics in their investment strategies. So I believe the number I read last by Bloomberg is that by 2030, $40 trillion under management is going to have ESG focus. So a lot of companies that have ESG performance. So ESG performance is, of course, scoring well on all three metrics, E, S, and G.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's where.
But how long has the ESG framework existed, and how long has it been sort of a function in a business environment, like a business function? Is this something that's gone
So,
mainstream in the last few years, 4, 5 years, or longer?
so the terminology has been used more recently, but sustainability in businesses has been going on since the 2000s. I think some companies even go back beyond. If you look at just the old school way, I think the Tatas used to do a lot of the S even like 120 years ago. They used to give even contract workers pension and a lot of things that like a lot of corporates are adopting today and looking at. But I think there are a lot of frameworks. So if you look at sustainability, I think GRI is one of the most popular ones that's used globally. But there's SASB, there's TCFD, there's a whole bunch of alphabet soups, there's integrated reporting. There are a lot of different frameworks companies use, and it all depends a lot on their geography. So a lot of European companies would use particular versus a lot of companies also report on SDGs, which are your sustainability development goals with their 17. So they report against that, against each goal, what they're doing and what they're not. And yeah, I think it's so everyone's been doing something. I think we've had enough COPs and we've had enough different, summits where people have been discussing it and how corporates can add value and improve. But in India, we have it was compulsory from last year. We have something called the BRSR, which is the Business Responsibility and Sustainability Report. I think the 2 year or 3 years predating it, we in India we had the BRR, which is the Business Responsibility Report. And I think in 2018 also in India we had something called the National Guidelines of Responsible Business Conduct, where we had 9 principles where companies would report against. So they would follow these. And so it covered a lot of topics. It covered environment, it covered social, it covered governance. So it's been there. I think ESG is now a more recent terminology of putting all your frameworks together. And because a lot of companies report multiple, report only one, it's really dependent on the regulatory environment at where they're at. It depends on their customers. It depends on a lot of things on why people report and how much they report.
So ESG, the three pillars of ESG, that's environment, social, and governance, they sort of lend into what we would term as sustainable business, right? Would that be an accurate way
Yeah.
of describing it when you talk about
Yes,
ESG and sustainability?
absolutely. It's so sustainability is not like I think a lot of people misunderstand sustainability as only environment, but I think even business continuity, business risk. I mean, even something like COVID, if you had your, checks and balances in place, you would be able to navigate it better. So yeah, it's a good way of doing business. We actually, we always start by telling clients that, ESG or sustainability is not different from your regular business. It's about integrating it across every step of your, of what you look at.
So,
And
does one pillar sort of, do you see one pillar of the framework tending to get more weightage or importance with Indian companies, right, than the other? For example, let's take maybe the environmental piece, which tends to be in the media the most, right, when you think about ESG, but or is it some of the other pillars that also, is it fairly equally sort of, is it an equally weighted framework? I guess
no, it's not. I'll tell you.
that
So,
would be a
like
question to ask.
there is in the in the industry, there are a lot of rating agencies that give ESG scores, and depending on the industry,
Okay.
they'll give different weightages to ES and G. So, I'll give you an example. Like the IT industry, most people sit in nice offices. They work in AC environments. They're mostly educated, technically educated people. Versus if you go to a chemicals or a cement factory, there's a lot of labor. There's a lot of contract labor, and there's a lot of human rights related things versus, so everyone has a different weightage. And I feel even the country you're in, so in India I feel S is not as spoken about or focused on as it should be.
We covered the first part, question one, right? So just one last question before we move to the next part of our discussion, right? So I wanted to just quiz you on the G part of ESG, which is the governance part, right? Um, Maybe this might just be a perception, but from a viewpoint of Indian organizations, how seriously do they treat governance, right? When I think about governance, I'm thinking about transparency across the board, whether it's in collecting data, sharing data, using decisions to using that data. Now, when every business takes decisions and they have data, first of all, where does the governance part come in, and how serious are Indian organizations on that
Certainly,
pillar?
so a lot of companies are serious about it. I think surprising point is that Indian companies actually perform very well on ESG ratings even compared to global peers. So your Infosys, Wipro, or Mahindra especially, absolutely exceptional on all these counts. Now, governance, it starts like what they say, it always should start from the board. Like it should start from where your leadership is, driving this. Like if it's not going to be driven from the top, you can put metrics and targets down at the bottom, but people may or may not take it seriously. So we look at governance on many levels. So one is that is your CEO and your board involved in sustainability related discussions? Are they part of the steering committee, or does somebody in the steering committee report to them? How often do they report to them? Is there independence in the board? So is it, yeah, I mean, I don't like using the term crony, but like normally a lot of promoter driven companies will have their family and friends on their board. And, you wouldn't really, I mean, everything goes, right? I mean, whatever you want to get passed will pass. And so we look at that. We actually even look at details like, are there independent directors chairing certain committees, your risk committee, your audit committee? Is it going to be you and your, I mean, is it going to be the promoter and his sons and his family, or is it going to be an independent director who's outside? We actually look at the experience of the directors, independent directors, how many companies they're on boards of, do they have the relevant experience to make the decisions they do? So we look at a lot of things, and of course the structure. I think the most important is to look at the governance structure and the policies they have in place. Because I think, like you mentioned yourself, like ethics and transparency is very important. We look at things like what policies do they have in place, like from the whistleblower policies to others. So we just look at a whole lot of metrics that there's a lot of long list that most companies should have. So that's what we.
Sure. Sure. We'll move on to the next question, which revolves around, how does sustainability/ESG differ from CSR, corporate social
Right.
responsibility, which is a buzzword today, right? In
Yeah.
many organizations, and which is a good thing, but they are different things. So, can you
I agree.
elaborate on that?
I'll tell you, at least in India, so a lot of people use sustainability and ESG as they use CSR as a sustainability term internationally, but in India, in 2013, they introduced it in the Companies Act where they made it mandatory. And India is one of the first countries to legally mandatory make companies report and perform on CSR. So what they've done is that companies that do have a turnover of 1,000 crores, a market cap of 500 crores, or an annual profit of above 5 crores a year, need to report an average of their 3 years profit. They have to spend on 2% of that on CSR. So what I look at it as there are a couple of things that CSR is not that you can spend money as a corporate on anything and everything you like. There are some permissible activities. So it could be from eradicating hunger and poverty, malnutrition, education, skill development is something that's quite popular. Interesting one is promoting rural and Olympic sports. So you see corporate logos on athletes. That's CSR. And of course, then there's protection of natural heritage. There are a lot of afforestation and climate projects corporates can, but there's a limit. You can't do anything and everything. You can't, I mean, do something that's not come under the act. You'll get audited. So today you have to report every cent of your CSR transparency, which I also feel is actually sometimes negative from the fact that sometimes a corporate can't find good projects to spend all that money in a single calendar year. They're focusing on their business. They don't have the time to do that, but it's compulsory. You have to. And so it's versus
Sure.
yeah. So when you ask what's the difference between ESG and sustainability, I feel that is what you end up doing with 100% of your focus and your business efforts should be towards the rest of everything, like making your business more sustainable, handling everything from business continuity to just good practices is nothing to do with your profits or otherwise. It's just a way of doing good business.
Sure. So would it be right in would it be right sort of saying that CSR is a little bit more of a an obligation in the sense that you have to put certain amount of your profits or invest in different activities which can have environmental benefits, social benefits, and whereas ESG is more I guess it's more very much the organization's day to day, right? It's
Correct.
forms an integral part of their day to day operations. It doesn't have to be something that's ancillary or you know.
No, no, and it has to do with their product. It has to do with the people who work with them. It has to do with the impact. So there's a lot of things that today there's a concept in ESG where you look at materiality. You look at what's materially important to your business, and that is what you kind of work towards. You build an action plan and you try to improve. Because what's materially important to an IT company will be very different from a cement manufacturer. Now, once you do that, now there's a new concept, not new, it's been a couple of years, called double materiality. It's not what how a business impacts the environment, it's also including how the environment impacts the business and vice versa. So people look at effects from both sides. That if a company does an X business, are they impacting biodiversity? If you're, treating a particular product with certain chemicals in your and it is mixed with the water, and when how do you discharge it? All these things come into play versus earlier you'd only look at how you get impacted versus now you look at both sides of how you're impacting and how you get impacted. So there's a lot more to it than what it was.
Sure. Okay. I wanted to touch on the acts, right? You mentioned some of the legislation over the last 10 odd years. You mentioned the Companies Act of 2013, with regards to yeah, some of the reports that they have to file. Can you talk a little bit more about that? So I think SEBI also has some
Yes.
obligations, right? When you list a
uh,
company, there are
right.
some requirements, disclosures that are required. I think you had mentioned when we had spoken offline about this, the BRSR report or
Correct.
business
Correct.
sustainability report. So, just touch on some of those
No,
points.
I'll tell you about that. So the SEBI's come up with it's one of the so India is quite progressive. I think a lot of countries haven't made it mandatory for corporates to report on these metrics. I think even the US hasn't, China hasn't. Some in Europe are a bit ahead, but otherwise there's still quite a few countries that actually don't. So the top 1,000 listed companies by market capitalization have to report a BRSR compulsory from last year. I think for the 2 years before that, the format was issued. And what SEBI's done, which is a good thing, is that they've covered like a couple of hundred topics. It's not a small report or a small effort by any means. I think there's a proper amount of effort needed by every corporate to put this report together. But what they've done is they've broken it up into what they call essential indicators and leadership indicators. So leadership indicators are, I'll give you a simple example. Today, every corporate has a carbon footprint. So you have a scope one and a scope two, which is easier to calculate in your operational boundaries. So that becomes under essential. You have to report that. Scope three, which is your supply chains, is comes in leadership. So it's not compulsory, but there are companies who do it. So if you do it, you report it. But if not, it's not compulsory to report, but it's actually, how do you say? I mean, I'm trying to put a nice analogy. It's like a net practice to what you need to do later. So all the companies know, they read it as part of the report, saying, okay, I've left this blank this year, but let me put my head together and see how I can answer it well. And and so they have, yeah. So the SEBI's come across that, and an interesting thing is, I think in 2026, the top 150 companies by market cap will also have to report on their supply chain. So if you look at a company like Reliance Industries and look at their supply chain, they'll go into lakhs of suppliers. So that is something that's happening in India, and it's mandatory. So it's not an option anymore.
Got it. And that would, okay, you talk about supplies, that could be manufacturing or services. It wouldn't matter.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Good. So I move to the third question. So this goes more into careers and the ESG domain. Uh, how does one get into career in ESG? Right? What are some of the skills that may be required for someone to get into this field? Qualifications wise, while my understanding is there are no specific you know qualifications that one may have. You did mention some certifications earlier, which we'll get
Correct.
to, but
Correct.
uh, can someone from any sort of field of education consider a career in ESG, or is it limited to a certain types of educational qualifications? And we'll go to the second part, which is the kind of organizations that would need these skill sets. So maybe you can answer the first
Yeah,
point on
sure,
the
sure.
education first.
So I feel today all companies and corporates basically would have some requirement for sustainability and ESG roles. It could be covering communications, it could be finance, it could be, there could be just a variety of roles. Like, of course, consulting. There's, I think there's across the board, like today, every company has to look at sustainable procurement. There's going to be sustainable design. There's just a lot of, like, I mean, today, if you look at what's happening in the FMCG space, look at the packaging. Everyone's like talking about recycled paper, recycle. All of these things come in. So there are jobs. I think what people need, would think that what people should do is, one is understand what corporates need, or like what corporates need to do. So of course you need to understand that the corporates that report, where would their footprint be? Would it be in their packaging? Would it be in their material sourcing? Would it be in their logistics? Like sometimes you advise a client that, okay, you may have a great relationship with XYZ supplier, but he's 5 states away. Why don't you build a relationship with somebody in this state you don't know at all, but figure out how you can source from a. So there's a lot of, I mean, I think everything today can be done better sustainably with this thing. And of course, there's report, there's tech, climate tech's become hot. There's just so many possible solutions. I mean, today there are, if you look at just the EV space, people are expecting electric vehicles from two-wheelers and four-wheelers. And hopefully we're looking at even logistics and large transport getting into it. There are going to be a lot of new skills, new roles required. I read recently, a few days ago, there's an international labor organization. They estimated about 24 million green jobs by 2030. So there's a lot on that. Even LinkedIn, I think I read a
This
report
would be in
saying that,
India or
no,
globally?
globally.
Okay. Okay.
And I think even in on LinkedIn, I read that they had a 2023 green skills report that says that demand for jobs is outpacing supply. And I just feel that, I feel that if I had to suggest to somebody how they can build a career path, I think is they need to first understand the entire landscape. So even if you're either an engineer or a business student or, whichever field, an art student, you need to understand what it is, like how industry or companies impact the environment. And I think there are some great courses. I'm pretty sure the colleges all have them now, but there are quite a few good offline ones where you understand climate, you understand sustainability, you understand what everything, why emissions are there. There could be, like at every like process. I mean, in a manufacturing unit, there could be emissions. So how do you, change things? How do you do things faster? Use less electricity, use less manpower, like, use better packaging. There's just a lot. So figure out what their passion is. And I would also actually, one of the things I'd like to say is people should today, especially now, we're the 2023 reports. So a lot of my job, I look at a lot of reports. So we have a client, I will look at his peers internationally, domestically. If we are interested in a particular industry, I'd look at like 10, 20, and I've probably seen over 200 reports in the last year and a half. And I just feel that today, the way companies report on what they're doing, it could be part of their sustainability report or just some of their regular disclosures. People will actually see opportunities. They'll see, hey, I can do this. I'd like to do this. I think measuring, today a lot of companies don't know how to measure their emission. And they go outsource and professionals. I think a lot of that stuff can happen inside. There are a lot of tech tools that you can take the data and help build things. There's a lot they can do. So I think understanding the reporting standards. So if somebody is looking for a job in India, I think GRI and BRSR are the most popular. You'd like look at what's asked and what's needed, and do the companies have the competencies? A lot of companies outsource a lot of it, but I'm pretty certain over time they're going to build all of this in house. So,
Mm.
I think today transitioning of your current skills is probably easy. Like I had a business background. I had my own little business of apparel. And that's one of the things that when I was interviewing for this job, I mean, we are dealing with corporates. So if I look at everything that I look at in sustainability, how would I do that in my company? And then think about it from the other side, at my client side, saying, hey, if this was my business, this is what we need to do. And that's the kind of skill I transitioned was business skills. But I think yeah, there'll be a lot of skills like engineering skills, a lot of other things that you need. There'll be tech skills that I think people should try to transition within that. I think in other interesting thing people should look at is look within their companies, talk to their HR and say, hey, has there been any requirement for building out, or you're looking outside? I'd like to give it a shot and do something else, because there aren't too many seasoned professionals, to be honest. There are a good amount, but there aren't too many, and I think it's wide open so companies can. I've seen it happen in a lot of companies we work with, that their entire sustainability and CSO team are actually people who've come internally. They've actually headed different departments and now they're working here because they understand their business.
Right. Got it. So it seems to me that this could be a sort of a mid-career move, right? When you're already in a certain domain. Let's say you're in procurement, you decide to get into sustainable procurement or packaging or design or even tech, right? You're a techie, and then you decide to get into something like climate tech, which is more sustainable oriented. So it seems like a mid-career, it gives you that optionality because you have a expertise in a specific domain or function. Would that be accurate, or do you see people sort of straight out of business school or you know engineering school get into this domain?
So like I said earlier, I personally feel that it's important to have a transitionable skill. So if you're an engineer, you can transition
Mm.
that skill. If you're a finance, you can, there always going to be something. Like I think having that is important, because I think if you go straight out of college, I mean, companies have to report, and I think they understand that people from their industry would understand them best. So you may not need. I think fresh grads may have a slightly harder, unless they have degrees from like a TISS, or and a couple of schools that do a lot of environmental science. They do a lot of that. I think again, it would be very technical jobs. But if you're looking in the reporting corporate, there isn't much. So that's something you got to upskill yourself on the side, and be part of a team, and I think a lot of corporates will need to. So today, even in a corporate, like I have experiences with companies where they will dedicate a team to work with us and say, okay, these are going to be your points of contact, and they don't understand anything. And I actually feel that training them first would be important. So if somebody comes in and says, hey, I'm hungry, I'm ready to learn everything, and I'll deal with the professionals to build this and put this out there, could be an opportunity.
Sure. On the institutes, you mentioned TIS, Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Any other sort of institutes come to mind, or
Not too
there are?
many. So I'll tell you.
Hmm.
So on the pure play sustainability front, there'll be a lot of the I think the more the arts, there will be courses in a lot of the colleges now. I think I'm seeing a lot of smaller courses. Like I actually even came across a course by Stanford that had a CSO course. So it's basically a program on how to be a chief sustainability officer. There are a lot of I've come across courses by Wharton and otherwise that do courses on ESG, but like I said, I it's relatively new, so I don't even think those courses are tried and tested and have got enough people out there. I think it's so like I said, it's not different from business. It's just a different way of doing things. Uh,
Sure.
I came across a very interesting thing in the newspaper 2 days ago in the Eco Times where they said that companies are looking to link CXO compensation with sustainability KPIs. And that is actually we have a proprietary framework we use to assess a company and how they can do better. So we always look at what's a best in class metric and where the company is at. And we take uh, qualitative data and we try to quantify it and say, hey, you're on a 1 to 4 and you can get to a 3 by doing this, you can get to a 4 by doing this and this. And that's one of the things we always look at, that globally a lot of CEO and a lot of key managerial personnel's compensations linked to sustainability targets. So if they have a 10-year plan, every year they'll have to reach a certain percentage, and their compensations are linked with that. So I think that's a trend that I'm seeing, that things are changing. People are looking at it more, and at the end of the day, I mean, you're going to have a need to, like, if you have these targets and your compensations linked to it, you're going to have teams to execute, report, do a lot of that. So I see that happening. I do see that happening a lot.
Sure. I'm just going to touch on, the kind of organizations in the Indian corporate landscape that, would have a need or demand for these skills, right? So, I mean, before you answer it, I'll just sort of put it into three baskets, break it up into three baskets. One, you've got the consulting firms, which include the big four. Within the big four, I think PwC, NY have very large practices here. And of course, in the strategy firms, McKinsey, BCG, Accenture, KPMG, Deloitte. So these seem to be some of the names with my basic research that I've done that have these kinds of consulting practices.
Right.
Then you've got the MNC companies. Many of them operate in India. So Amazon, Google of the world. So they've got net zero carbon emission targets, which are 10, 20 years in the making. You've got, consumer companies like Patagonia, Unilever, where it's more focused on the sustainable sourcing angle, right? Then you've got financial companies. So Goldman Sachs, the investment firms of funds, where there could be opportunities there on the investing side. And I think you touched on it earlier in our discussion. So that's the second bucket, the MNCs. And the third would be the Indian companies. You also mentioned a few earlier, right? I think you mentioned Mahindra, Tata's, the Aditya Birla Group, the tech companies, Infosys, TCS, uh, FMCG, Asian Paints, pharma companies also. So I was looking at some of the data we have on the candidates, right, in the market. Pharma companies, ESG tends to be a very, well-established sort of job or function. Energy companies are another one where you tend to see a few more of these naturally. So when you're talking about the environment, I'll leave it there. I'll just ask you to add on to that in terms of these buckets or anything more you want to sort of add to that.
No, no, absolutely. So I think the big consult, like the four accounting firms and the big three consulting plus all the others, there are a lot of opportunities there, and even at the junior level because they're building teams. The good thing with them is they actually have a lot of subject matter experts. So they may not be like, I wouldn't say they're not all rounders, but they have a lot of subject matter experts. So if you're cement company and you need a decarbonization strategy on your logistics, they will have guys who've done it in South America, Europe, and America, and they've done it well. So they'll pull them in for at least some of the project and say, hey, we've got a subject matter expert. And there's a lot of people who can learn from them, from their teams. They have massive teams and they're building it out. So I do believe they're hiring. So that is something that can, but again, they're going to hire with somebody who's different from the rest. Like you have to have at least something over more than having a regular basic engineering degree or a basic MBA or a basic. There has to be something that that like you kind of gives you an edge in this field. So maybe doing something on the side. The MNCs, of course, as you mentioned, very strong. They already have their, like you said, they have their targets already. Globally, they've put it out there, and all their affiliates have to follow the same. So there's a lot of a requirement here where today, if you've got large companies like a Siemens or a Bosch or like the big guys, their teams here will have to meet their targets. If they've got a 2035, 2040 target, it's it's if all the manufacturing's done here, I'm saying a lot of this, so then a lot of the footprint is here. So that's where actually more effort needs to be there. So wherever, like today, if you've got a head office in Europe, but your manufacturing is being done in India and China, that's where you're gonna have, you need larger teams to drive this. So yeah, there is a huge demand on that. And I think the Indian companies, like I said, I mean, I think I've been more impressed with Indian companies on reporting. I heard something that in Wipro as far back as 2006, uh, uh, like all department heads were actually asked about their emissions from the last meeting to the next, and they had to spend 60 seconds on shooting out like what they have they improved, not improved, and if not, why, and like quick, and then move on to the next. So they've actually been doing this for longer than most. Before it was compulsory. And I think the requirement here is huge. A lot of Indian companies, our largest companies, a lot of them are net exporters. It could be tech, it could be manufacturing, it could be in most cases. And today, everyone large globally needs their supply chain to report, because there is a statistic that I think above 90% of any company's emissions is in their scope 3. It's not in their direct operational boundary, it's in their supply chain. So today, that is where the focus is. They will invest with you. They will tell you that, hey, we need this. I'm seeing this in SMEs and MSMEs where they say that, hey, we supply for some of these really large companies in Europe, and we need to, they've asked us to get, like EcoVadis is a very large rating company, and they're like, we need to get audited by them, and we need to work on X, Y, and Z. So they know what they need to do.
Mm.
They've been told what they need to do, but they need someone to help them implement it. So yeah, that's in-house speciality. And I think what I didn't touch upon in the first basket you mentioned is there are a lot of Indian homegrown consulting firms. Ours is a pretty small firm, but there are a lot of homegrown consulting firms that are actually working in this space. So I think that would also be something that's an interesting thing for candidates to look at.
Sure. Great. I think we covered a lot there on that point. So we'll move towards the final part of the discussion, which is just again, what are some of the potentially myths and perceptions about ESG? Is it misunderstood? Sometimes you may hear about in the news where it gets bad media press. There could be anti-ESG sentiment. Why is it good? Why it may not be so good? Maybe you can just talk about that. I know you had a few things to say on this, so I'll open it up to you.
Absolutely. No, no, absolutely. So yeah, so a lot of sustainability purists feel ESG is a bad word. It's a finance metric. They feel it's purely market driven, and they're not 100% wrong. So a lot of times when people talk about ESG, they'll ask you about your score. So a lot of the large companies, there's a MSCI, and they'll give you a rating. So you get an A, B, or C, and you get scores. There's a global company called Sustainalytics, which gives corporate scores, and a lot of people look at the scores. And in India, we have a couple of homegrown ESG rating companies that give scores. Reuters, which is now taken over by LSEG, they give so a lot of scores. And to be fair, these scores are taken from what you put in your annual report, and that is where I feel there is some potential for greenwashing or manipulation where if there isn't like today, a lot of companies report and they put assurance. They'll get an external auditor, an ENY or a KPMG to do an external assurance and say, hey, we've reported this and we've got assurance certificate from X, Y, and Z. That if I report this is my carbon footprint, they've actually checked all the data that I've used and come to the same number. So I think the data quality is something that's there. The thing about ESG, I think I might have mentioned it earlier, that it's about a corporate's operational boundary. And today, what a lot of companies do, I won't take a name, but there's a real estate company that's very highly ranked on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index and has got an incredible ESG score. Indian company, but if you look at the annual report, the first two pages have companies not included in our scope. And in really, really tiny, tiny print, like ant size print, they fill two full pages of names. So there must be a few hundred companies or that are not included in the scope where I feel probably a lot of the emissions or a lot of the stuff is probably moved on. And they're like, hey, within our operational boundary, this is it. So that is something that I feel can be. I think one of the first shocks for me in this industry was when I, joined this industry and said, hey, who are the best companies in the world? Let me look up a couple of lists. And Exxon and Shell were in the top 10, and oil and gas companies, everyone says that there's an exclusion clause in investing in, and they say that no defense, no tobacco, oil and gas, these are companies you don't invest in if you have an ESG portfolio. I'm like, how are these guys there? Because they only report scope 1 and scope 2 about their offices. They basically, all the offshore rigs and everything are given to contract companies or outside. They basically literally buy and sell, trade the pro material. They have an office, they have employees, their footprint. It's not as, so if you take the emission of their product, like if you have oil and gas and say like, hey, what's the footprint of all the diesel you've sold? I mean, it would probably be the most, I mean, it would, be the highest. So there's a lot of potential to manipulate. There's a lot of evolving regulations. It's not static. Like your science-based targets initiative, which everyone is trying to, report net zero targets. Originally, they came out with a plan saying that you can't use carbon credits to reduce your net zero. Now, recently, I think this year or the last year, they came up saying you're allowed to use carbon credits because it's very hard for most companies to go to net zero without that. And so, there's a lot of changing, so a lot of people feel that it can be manipulated, can. But I mean, I'll tell you why I feel it's good. I think let's take India, for example, since this is our region of focus. And if you take the BRSR, today, I feel you can't really improve unless you don't know what you're improving and you're not measuring it. So today, by compulsorily, having to report this, like your scope 1, scope 2 emissions, your waste, your water, they don't just leave it at water. They look at your consumption versus your discharge. They have a lot of compulsory metrics: your waste, your hazardous, non-hazardous, how much goes to landfill. They have a lot of these metrics, and I just feel that when companies are conscious, like I've been in a company and there are a lot of times I've sold waste without knowing where it actually goes. It was just something I needed to move and didn't want to spend time on, and today a lot of people have to. It's not a choice. I think it just makes it just keeps corporates on track. You have to report. So I think on the environmental front there's a lot that's good, and it's going to be improving. So a lot of companies today join alliances. They declare things like zero waste to landfill. That's a metric companies are proud to put on the first page of their sustainability report. And they say they're water positive. That means they actually do rainwater harvesting more than what they consume. So there are a lot of these metrics that I feel probably would have got ignored if it wasn't for these kind of corporate frameworks. I also feel a lot of times, I think we've heard of multiple horror stories back in the day about children in China and sweatshops, and everyone loves good quality products, but no one knows what's happening to the supply chain. And today, I think like the S gets covered where there's a lot of human rights due diligence done. There's a lot of employee health and safety that's taken care of. Today, you'll see corporates in construction and otherwise who have absolutely great health and safety measures. I remember coming across a report, I think it was Godrej Properties, and they spent a couple of pages on the health and safety of their employees. And it's just, I think, it's, And today, the BRSR even covers contract labor, which is something that wasn't. It's like what percentage of your labor is contract labor, and they even ask if there are any benefits towards it. A lot of corporates don't, but they've put it out there. Now they know people are reading it. That are there any health benefits? Are there any accident insurance for contract workers? It's a metric that's there. You have to report it. If it's zero, it's zero. If it's 100%, it's 100%. But people are aware, and I just feel it keeps things more real. And I think again, even on G, like your governance today, there are a lot of promoter-run companies and a lot of really big ones. That I mean, I think people would, by me just saying that, they'd probably a lot of names would come to head. But I think today having compulsory transparency and ethics policies, related party transactions, so people are not just buying from their family and friends and keeping their shareholder, I mean, if you're a listed company, you're buying, you're booking your profit elsewhere. So they try to keep things real. We look at independence of the board. Like, do you have enough independent directors, and, what's their, I think that all of it is important. I agree that it can be manipulated. It can possibly be this thing, but I think it is a good way of doing business. I think an example I gave you earlier, that 2 days ago I read about the CXO's compensations being linked with sustainability KPIs. That wouldn't have happened if it wasn't, something that can be tracked, reported. So I think these are really important changes that are in, like, I think ESG and these frameworks bring about, and it
Mm.
becomes a best practice. So today you meet a company, you say, hey, do you just want to comply with what the locals say, that just give your BRSR and stop there? Or do you want to do more? Do you want to see what your global peers are doing? Do you want to lead in India? Do you want to exceed? Do you want to do better than what, like, find out what the best metrics are, and you want to set those kind of goals and ambitions? So there's a lot of that. And I feel if you don't have these kind of formulations, you don't have those kind of targets. And I think, yeah, there is a bit of peer pressure. Everyone wants to be one of the best in class and best in their segment. And if you know your competitors are doing a lot better, and I think, yeah, that's.
Good. So I think, Gautam, I've got everything that I wanted to cover out. Is there anything that maybe we have missed, or anything else you want to talk about?
No, I think one thing I actually did miss, it just struck me much later when we are talking about this, is, when you asked about the finance industry and about jobs in the finance industry. Today, there's a concept on banks and insurance companies reporting financed emissions. So they have to report the footprint of all their clients that they've given loans to. So mostly corporate, not individual. So today, if you're financing or insuring any asset, any business, anything, you need to report their footprint. It may not come as your footprint, but if you financed it, it is something you need to report. And I just feel, at least from what I've seen, not just India, globally, people are pretty under resourced in figuring all this out. So it's another opportunity. I feel that people who have good skills in that field, there's a lot of
Yeah.
climate risk. There are good courses on that I feel that people could do. I'm actually planning on doing one myself. And yeah, I think it's climate risk is a avenue I did mention, but I think there are going to be a lot of jobs in that field in time.
Sure. On that point, I think when we were talking offline, we were talking about, now with AI coming in across the board, and, these supercomputers and super servers that are coming in more on the environmental side, and again, emissions. And do you see that being sort of an additional sort of source of emissions, right? With all of these new technologies that are coming into play. Your quick thoughts.
No, of course. I think it was in the last few days I read it. Google has now had to change their entire, I think because of AI, Google's emissions have gone up significantly from what their target and their baseline was and what they anticipated it would be. So they've had to redo, they've had to actually retract on some of their statements and say, hey, now we got to figure this out again. And it's going to happen. But what I do feel is that anybody who takes on the data center or that footprint will have to figure out how to solve it soon. So yes, it will add a lot of additional footprint. But if it does make work easier, it does make work faster, it's needed, but I also feel that it's very, very emission heavy. One interesting point on that is we had a client in the telecom industry, and the carbon footprint of an SMS versus a carbon footprint of a WhatsApp message. The WhatsApp message is 14 times more. So, people who send
Wow.
WhatsApp messages very flippantly, it versus an SMS, it's 14 times X, it's 14x emission.
And what is AI? What is the multiple on the on
AI
maybe
is
like an
a
AI
lot.
query? Yeah.
It's a lot. I think they say the load is at least 5 to 10x on regular servers and regular search and regular stuff. The moment you put AI into the same search or the same set of tasks, it takes 5 to 10x. So yeah, and I think it's easily adopted. I think it's something that a lot of the younger generation is adopting and using for everything. So there's going to be a lot of usage. I do see that coming up.
Sure. So I think what's really coming out of this is that, almost every sector, whether it's manufacturing, energy, services, technology, you mentioned financial services, it's all interesting and investing. In almost every industry, there are applications of, where the ESG framework is being applied, right, in very different ways, but towards the same end goal. So I think that can be a takeaway. Our
Yeah, I mean,
discussion.
I've come across law firms and investment banks that have ESG teams because they need it. Their clients are asking them questions and they need it. So it's not that they'll go to an outside consultant. They are actually building the capabilities in-house. I wouldn't have thought some time back that law firms would have ESG teams, but they do.
Gautam, on that note, thank you so much for your time. I think this was very
Pleasure,
educational
Andre.
and informative. And if anyone wants to reach out to you directly,
LinkedIn.
what
LinkedIn is
would you
the
suggest?
best.
LinkedIn,
LinkedIn
your
is the best.
website at ECube. Great.
Yeah, you please, absolutely. If there's anyone who has any this thing, you can reach out to us. ECube does have it's ecubeindia.in. So that's our website. And yeah, or you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. When you put up the podcast, you can probably put my details into.
Great. Thank you so much,
All
Gautam,
right.
and
Yes.
wish you the best in your career moving ahead in this space.
Thank you. Exciting times.